In October 1929, a wealthy banker named Joseph Kennedy sat down in a barber chair in Wall Street to get his shoes polished. Kennedy was a shark. He made millions manipulating stocks. As the boy buffed his shoes, he looked up at Kennedy and said, "Mr. Kennedy, you should buy Hindenburg stock. It's going to the moon." Kennedy smiled, tipped the boy, and walked straight back to his office. He called his broker and gave a simple order: sell everything. His partners thought he was crazy. The market was at an all-time high. Everyone was getting rich. Why would he sell now? Kennedy replied with a line that has become legendary. The shoe shine boy is giving stock tips. The market is full. There is nobody left to buy. He got out. Days later, the market collapsed. The great crash of 1929 wasn't just a bad week on the stock market. It was the moment the American dream turned into a nightmare. It wiped out $30 billion in 2 days, more than the cost of World War I. But here's the scary part. The exact financial weapon that caused the 1929 crash is back today. We just call it by a different name. To understand the crash, you have to understand the party that came before it. The 1920s were called the Roaring Twenties for a reason. World War I was over. Electricity was lighting up cities. Henry Ford was pumping out cars. For the first time in history, ordinary Americans, plumbers, teachers, cooks, felt like they could get rich without working. The stock market became a national obsession. It was the crypto of its day. You didn't buy a stock for the dividend. You bought it because you thought a greater fool would buy it from you next week for double the price. But the fuel for this fire wasn't cash. It was debt. Wall Street invented a new toy called buying on margin. Here's how it worked. If you wanted to buy $100 worth of Ford stock, you didn't need $100. You only needed $10. The broker would lend you the other $90. This was magic. If the stock went up 10%, you didn't make a 10% profit. Because you only put down $10, you made a 100% profit. It turned boring stocks into a slot machine that always paid out. By 1929, nearly 40% of all loans in the United States were used to buy stocks. The entire economy was built on a tower of IOUs. The bartender was trading on margin. The taxi driver was trading on margin. They all believed the lie that Yale economist Irving Fisher told them just weeks before the end. Stock prices have reached what looks like a permanently high plateau. They were wrong. The leverage that made them rich on the way up was about to kill them on the way down. By September 1929, the market was defying gravity. It had been going up for 9 straight years. If you bet against it, you went broke. But one man refused to drink the Kool-Aid. His name was Roger Babson. He was a statistician who treated the stock market like physics, action and reaction. He knew that the higher the artificial climb, the harder the fall. On September 5th, 1929, he stood up at a business conference and dropped a bomb. He said, "Sooner or later, a crash is coming and it may be terrific." The market heard him. For a few hours, stocks dipped. This was known as the Babson break. But then human nature took over. The big banks and the experts laughed at him. They called him a fearmonger. They published articles saying there is no cause for alarm. The market recovered and went right back up. Investors looked at the dip and thought, see, the market is invincible. They bought the dip. They doubled down on their margin loans. They ignored the fire alarm because they were having too much fun at the party. They didn't know it, but that was their last chance to escape. The crash didn't happen all at once. It started on Thursday, October 24th. We call it Black Thursday. When the opening bell rang, the market felt there were no buyers. Prices started to slip. Then the trap snapped shut. Remember those margin loans? When the stock price dropped just a few points, the brokers panicked. They issued margin calls. They telephoned their clients and said, "Send more cash now, or we sell your stock." The clients didn't have cash, they only had debt. So the brokers sold the stock automatically to cover the loans. This dumping of stock caused prices to drop further, which triggered more margin calls, which caused more selling. It was a self-feeding loop of destruction. By 11 a.m., there was blind panic. Then something incredible happened. The Avengers of Wall Street arrived. At noon, heads of the biggest banks, Morgan, Chase, National City, held a secret emergency meeting. They decided to pool their money to stop the crash. They sent Richard Whitney, the vice president of the exchange, onto the floor. He walked to the post for U.S. Steel and shouted, "I buy 10,000 shares at $205, price way above the market value." He did this for blue chip stock after blue chip stock. It worked. The sliding stopped. Market rallied. People cheered. They thought the banks were more powerful than the math. They went home that weekend thinking the worst was over. They were wrong. The banks hadn't stopped the crash. They had just paused it. The weekend passed. The bankers told the newspapers, the market is fundamentally sound. They lied. On Tuesday, October 29th, Black Tuesday, the dam broke. When the market opened, there were no buyers. None. Usually, if you want to sell a stock for $100 and nobody buys it, you lower it to $99. But on this day, you could lower it to $50, and there was still nobody. The greater fool was gone. And then the machines failed. In 1929, stock prices were printed on a thin strip of paper called ticker tape that chugged out of a glass machine in every broker's office. It could print about 285 characters per minute. That was fast enough for a normal day. This wasn't a normal day. The volume of selling was so massive, millions of shares being dumped every hour, that the machine physically couldn't keep up. By 12 p.m., tape was 2 hours late. By 2 p.m., it was 4 hours late. Created a fog of war. Imagine you are a trader. You are watching the tape and it says General Electric is trading at $200. You think you are safe, but that price is from 4 hours ago. In reality, on the floor of the exchange, General Electric is already trading at $140. You are bankrupt, but you won't know it for another 4 hours. Panic isn't when people scream. Panic is when people go silent. The floor of the NYSE became a mob scene. Grown men were crying. Fistfights broke out over the few remaining phone booths. They were trying to call their banks to save their homes, but the lines were dead. By the time the closing bell rang at 3 p.m., the ticker tape kept printing and printing and printing. It didn't stop until 7:45 p.m. Took the machines 4 extra hours just to tell the world that it was poor. There is a famous image of the crash, bankers jumping out of windows on Wall Street. That is mostly a myth. While a few did take their own lives, like the president of Union Cigar, most of the masters of the universe survived. They lost their fortunes, but they kept their lives. The real tragedy happened to the people who weren't in the skyscrapers. It happened to the hotel clerks, the elevator operators, and the factory workers. They had taken their life savings, money meant for food and rent, and put it into the market on margin. When the closing bell rang on Black Tuesday, $30 billion had evaporated. To put that in perspective, that was more money than the United States spent fighting the entirety of World War I. And it vanished in 48 hours. But the nightmare was just beginning. Yet the crash on Wall Street triggered a panic on Main Street. People realized that their banks had been gambling with their deposits. They rushed to the local bank branches to withdraw their savings. This is called a bank run. You have to understand, in 1929, there was no FDIC insurance. If the bank went bust, your money was gone forever. Lines stretched for blocks. People banged on the doors, but the vaults were empty. The money wasn't there. It was lost in the stock market crash. Thousands of banks collapsed. Millions of families who had never even bought a stock lost their life savings because their banker got greedy. The Roaring Twenties were dead. The Great Depression had begun. The party was over and the bill had arrived. The consequences of the crash weren't just lines on a chart, they were physical. By 1933, the United States looked like a different country. Unemployment hit 25%. 1 in every 4 men had no job and no way to feed his family. 9,000 banks failed. The money simply vanished. Industrial production fell by 47%. The factories that were booming just 3 years earlier were now rusting in silence. But the most dangerous consequence wasn't economic, it was political. When people lose everything, they get angry. They look for strongmen to save them. In the United States, this anger led to the New Deal and a massive expansion of government power. In Germany, the economic shockwave from Wall Street destroyed the local economy, causing hyperinflation and a mass unemployment. You can draw a straight line from the margin traders of 1929 to the battlefields of World War II. The greed of the few led to the suffering of the millions. After the dust settled, the government swore this would never happen again. They passed the Glass-Steagall Act in 1933. This was a simple but brilliant law. It said, you cannot be a gambler and a vault at the same time. It forced banks to split. You could either be a commercial bank taking grandma's deposits and making safe loans, or an investment bank, gambling on stocks. You could not do both. For 60 years it worked. We had no major financial panics, but Wall Street has a short memory and deep pockets. They spent decades lobbying to kill that law. In 1999, they finally succeeded. The Glass-Steagall Act was repealed. The firewall was torn down. 9 years later, we had the 2008 financial crisis. And today, we are right back where we started. Massive leverage, banks gambling with depositor money, and a stock market that looks eerily like a permanently high plateau. Rockefeller showed us how to build a monopoly. The crash of 1929 showed us how it all falls down. The history books tell us that 1929 was a once-in-a-lifetime event. But if you look at the charts today, the debt levels, the margin debt, the speculation, it looks like history is rhyming. The difference is that in 1929, the government let the banks fail. Today, they print trillions to keep them alive. We have traded a depression for inflation. Which one is worse? That is the question we all have to answer. Subscribe and ring the bell. We are building the ultimate library of economic truth, and you need to be notified when the next file is declassified. My question for you, do you think the government should bail out the stock market when it crashes? Or should they let the gamblers go bankrupt, even if it hurts the economy? I want to read your debates in the comments. Class dismissed.